The notification came through at 2:37 in the afternoon while I was sitting in a safety briefing in a portable trailer outside Timmins. It wasn't a call. It was a text from my neighbor, Roger Thiessen, a retired electrician who'd lived next door to us for 11 years. Roger had never once texted me anything longer than, "Your garbage bins are still out." This one was different. "Call me right now. Something's wrong with Emma. I can hear her through the fence. Your mother-in-law is here. It's bad." I stepped out of that trailer without saying a word to anyone. Roger picked up before the first ring finished. He told me he'd been out pruning the cedar hedge along our shared fence line when he heard my daughter screaming. Not the way kids scream when they're playing or when they've scraped their knee. The kind of screaming that makes your stomach drop. He said he'd looked through the slats in the fence and seen something he couldn't fully describe, but the words he used were deliberate and they were laughing. Emma is 8 years old. She's in grade 3. She likes drawing animals, and she has this way of humming to herself when she's concentrating that I've never been able to replicate. That little, tuneless, half melody that means she's somewhere good inside her own head. She's scared of deep water, and she's scared of the dark, and she's scared of being alone in rooms she doesn't know. My mother-in-law, Vivienne Lachance, had known that for years. I accessed a home security app from the parking lot of that trailer in Timmins, Ontario, while the boreal forest sat gray and indifferent all around me, and I watched what was happening inside my own house from 600 kilometers away. The feed from the utility room in the basement was grainy but clear enough. Emma was in the corner behind the water heater, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest in the dark. The light wasn't on. The small window that faces the backyard had been covered with something. Cardboard, maybe. And the room looked black except for the greenish tinge of the night vision setting. I could see her shaking. I could see her mouth open. I couldn't hear the audio on the camera, but Roger had heard it clearly enough through a cedar hedge. The feed from the kitchen showed my mother-in-law at the island counter with a glass of wine. My sister-in-law, Petra Lachance, was leaning against the refrigerator. They were talking. Petra checked her phone once and said something, and my mother-in-law laughed. I watched that for 14 seconds before I closed the app and started making calls. The drive from Timmins to Sudbury, then south on Highway 69 through Parry Sound and down into the GTA and across to Mississauga, is roughly 5.5 hours on a clear day. I have driven that route in winter, in ice, in the dark, and I have never driven it like I drove it that afternoon. My brother Warren, who is 3 years younger than me and works in residential construction in Brampton, was at my house in 40 minutes. I know because he texted me when he pulled in. I had one other call to make before I got on the highway. She was a woman named Constance Faber. We'd served together in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry for 6 years before she transitioned out and I transitioned out, and we each went on to entirely different lives. She had become something I won't describe too precisely, but when I told her what I'd seen on the camera feed, she didn't ask questions. She said, "I'll be there in 25 minutes. Ahead of your brother or right after?" I said ahead. Then I got in my truck and I drove. There's a particular kind of helplessness that has nothing to do with weakness. I've been in situations overseas where I did not know if I would be alive the following morning, and I held it together because that was what the situation required. Sitting in that truck, watching the kilometers count down on the dash display, knowing my daughter was in the dark in our basement while the woman who called herself her grandmother drank wine in the kitchen above her head. That was a different thing entirely. That cracked something open in me that I have not been able to fully close since. Vivienne Lachance, 63 years old, retired bookkeeper from Gatineau. She'd made an event of being a grandmother from the moment Emma was born. Photo books and monogrammed birthday cards and a Christmas sweater tradition she'd started and would reference at family dinners with the particular self-satisfaction of someone who believed in the image more than the substance. My wife Sandra and I had separated 14 months prior. The separation had been mutual in the sense that we both agreed it was over, but not mutual in any other sense. Sandra had gone to stay with her mother in Gatineau initially. She was back in Mississauga now in an apartment 12 minutes from our house, and we had a co-parenting arrangement that the family court had formalized. Emma went to Sandra on alternating weeks. I had her the other weeks. This was my week. I had not known that Sandra had asked her mother to come and stay, or that she'd be looking after Emma after school while Sandra was at work. That arrangement had not been disclosed to me. I would later learn that was intentional. Warren texted me at 4:46. "She's out. Emma's out. Roger got her." I had to pull over. I sat on the shoulder of Highway 400 for about 90 seconds with my hands on the wheel and my forehead against the back of my hands. When I could see clearly again, I pulled back onto the highway. What had happened, I pieced together later from Roger, from Warren, and from Constance. Roger had not waited after calling me. He'd gone to the front door and knocked, and when my mother-in-law answered, he'd told her he'd heard a child in distress and asked to come in. She told him it was none of his business and started to close the door. Constance arrived at that point, and Constance has a way of being present in a doorway that tends to end arguments quickly. They got to the front door, and then they got to the utility room, and then they got Emma out. Peel Regional Police were called. An ambulance was there by the time I arrived because Roger had mentioned that Emma had been in an enclosed space without ventilation, and they wanted to check her. I turned onto my street at 6:58 p.m. The police lights were going. There were 3 cruisers and the ambulance, and there were neighbors out on the lawns, the way people come out when something has happened that you can't unsee. My mother-in-law was sitting on the front steps in a way that suggested she'd been placed there and told not to move. Pater was beside a cruiser with an officer standing close. Warren was on the driveway, and the expression on his face when he saw my truck was the specific expression of a man who has seen something he wished he could unsee and is relieved that the responsible adult has arrived. Roger came to my window before I'd finished parking. "She's okay," he said. "She's with the paramedics. She's asking for you." Emma was in the back of the ambulance with a female paramedic named Shayla who had the kind of steadiness you want in a person during the worst moments of your life. Emma was wrapped in a blanket and she had red pressure marks on her wrists and both arms from where she'd been pushing against the walls in the dark. When she saw me, she said, "Daddy, I kept calling and no one came." I don't have words for that moment that aren't inadequate, so I won't try. I held her for a long time. Long enough that Shayla quietly stepped out of the ambulance and pulled the doors half closed to give us the space. Later, after Shayla had completed her assessment, a detective named Claude Moreau introduced himself. He was a methodical, low-key man who looked like he had been doing this long enough that very little surprised him, but who also looked like this had surprised him. He told me they'd be taking statements, that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were being detained for questioning, and that he'd need to speak with Emma when she was ready, with a child advocate present. "I have camera footage," I told him. "The whole house. I've had cameras running for 8 months. He looked at me steadily. "Why 8 months?" "Because of some things I noticed and couldn't prove. I want you to have all of it." Constance had already handled the evidence upload before I got there. She had done it the same way she'd done everything in her professional life, cleanly and without gaps in the chain of custody. She'd called in a favor from someone inside Peel Regional to ensure the footage was received properly. Detective Moreau raised his eyebrows when she told him this, but he didn't push back. Emma stayed in my arms on the driveway for a long time that evening. I finally told Warren we'd be going to his place for the night, and probably longer. He said he'd already made up the guest room and that his wife Laurel had gone to get groceries. Emma had, at some point, told Warren that she wasn't allowed to have gummy bears at her mother's house because her grandmother said they were childish junk. Warren had apparently bought 4 bags. I carried my daughter to my truck. She didn't want to let go of my jacket. In the truck, quiet, just the 2 of us in the night coming down outside. Emma said, "Grammy said you were too busy for me. That's why you go away for work, because you don't want to be home." I said, "That is not true. Not one word of that is true." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Grammy also said that I was going to go live with different people after Christmas." The temperature in that truck dropped about 15 degrees. "What else did she say?" I asked, and I kept my voice very, very steady. Emma pressed her face against my jacket. She said if I told anyone she'd make sure I never saw you again. Constance had texted me while I was at the hospital with Emma the following morning getting her properly assessed. The message said, "There's audio from the kitchen camera. 8 months of it. You need to hear the recordings from the last 3 months. All of it. Encrypted folder. You know the protocol. I knew the protocol. We'd established it. Back when she'd helped me set up the system. I listened to the recordings in the hospital parking lot while Emma slept in the room above me, exhausted from the examination and from the previous day and from the weight of whatever she'd been carrying alone. The earliest of the relevant recordings was from February. My mother-in-law's voice in the kitchen, speaking to Sandra. She needs to understand that she doesn't get to run to him every time she doesn't like the rules. You're not doing her any favors letting her think she has two homes. She has one home. He's a temporary arrangement. Sandra's voice. Mom, she loves him. She's 8. She loves whoever she's with. That's the point. You shape that now or you lose control of it entirely. I sat in that parking lot and listened to 11 recordings across 3 months. Each one was a piece of a picture I'd not wanted to see forming. The strategy, as it emerged across those recordings, was incremental. Vivienne had developed an opinion, somewhere in the previous year, that my access to Emma was the primary obstacle to Sandra's stability, and not incidentally, to Vivienne's own continued relevance in the family structure. She had convinced herself, or had convinced Sandra to agree, that Emma's attachment to me was the problem and that the solution was to erode it, methodically, carefully, in ways that wouldn't look intentional. She'd coached Sandra on what to say during our co-parenting exchanges. She'd suggested to Sandra that Emma's nightmares and anxiety at school were caused by the disruption of going between two houses, not by anything happening in Sandra's environment. She told Sandra that Emma had started talking back to her because I didn't enforce discipline, and that Emma needed to understand that her grandmother's house had rules that weren't optional. And then there was the recording from 6 weeks ago, Vivienne's voice late at night, quieter than usual. The utility room downstairs. It's dark. It's closed. There's no window she can get out of. An hour in there when she acts up and she'll stop associating your rules with something she can go complain to her father about. Kids need to be scared sometimes, Sandra. You were scared of me. You turned out fine. A pause. Sandra, very quietly, she's scared of the dark, Mom. I know. That's rather the point. I stopped the recording. I sat in that parking lot for a while. The sky over Mississauga was the particular washed-out gray of an April morning when the winter hasn't fully decided to leave. And I thought about the fact that I had been to Kandahar province and back, that I had done 2 tours and come home intact and built a career and raised a daughter who hummed to herself when she was happy. And the thing that had finally broken something fundamental in me was listening to a 63-year-old woman explain to my ex-wife why it would be useful to lock our child in a dark room. The family lawyer I retained is named Andrew Pemberton. He practices in Mississauga and has a reputation in family court that I had verified before I ever retained him. When I sat across from him the following morning, the same morning Emma was still sleeping at Warren's with 4 bags of gummy bears on the nightstand, he listened to every recording and reviewed every piece of footage without expression. Then he sat back in his chair. This is significant, he said, which from Andrew Pemberton means something. What are we looking at? On the criminal side, your mother-in-law is facing child confinement, unlawful restraint, and potentially child endangerment. Depending on how the Crown prosecutor chooses to frame the recordings, there could be conspiracy charges as well. He paused. Your ex-wife is in a complicated position. She appears on those recordings in a supervisory capacity during some incidents. She'll have to answer for that. And custody? He looked at me directly. You're going to have full custody by the end of this. I want you to be prepared for what that process looks like. It's not quick, but this evidence is unusually comprehensive. I know, I had help preparing it. I want to be honest about what the next 6 weeks look like, because I've seen these stories told in ways that make the father look more certain and more controlled than any real person actually is. The truth is that I drove Emma to school every morning and smiled and told her everything was okay, and then sat in the school parking lot for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive away. The truth is that I called Warren at 11 o'clock at night twice in that first week just to have someone to talk to who already knew everything. The truth is that Emma woke up screaming 3 times in the first 10 days, and each time I sat on the floor of Warren's guest room with my back against her bed until she went back to sleep, and I stared at the ceiling and went through contingencies in my head like a system check I couldn't turn off. I also made calls. My contact network from my military years is not something I discuss in detail, but it is real, and it is extensive, and some of those people have moved into professions where they are very good at finding things out through entirely legal means. A forensic financial analyst named Patrick, who I'd served with and who now ran a small firm in Ottawa, spent 3 weeks going through Vivienne Lachance's financial history at my request. What he found was not what I had expected. Vivienne Lachance had, for the previous 7 years, been slowly redirecting a portion of the estate funds from her late husband's investment accounts into accounts that her children did not know existed. Her husband, Jean-Pierre Lachance, had left a substantial estate that included registered accounts and non-registered investment portfolios intended to be divided among his 3 adult children. Vivienne had been named executor. She had used that position to withdraw, over time, amounts that totaled just under $340,000 that had never been declared to the estate. She had also, Patrick discovered, convinced Sandra to sign documents 18 months ago that restructured the portion of that estate Sandra was entitled to. The restructuring had, on paper, looked like a tax optimization strategy. In practice, it had routed Sandra's inheritance through a holding structure that Vivienne controlled. Sandra had not understood what she was signing. Her own mother had defrauded her. I sent that information to Andrew Pemberton and to Detective Moreau simultaneously. The criminal charges came first. Vivienne was charged with unlawful confinement, criminal negligence in relation to a child, and breach of trust. Her bail conditions included no contact with Emma and no entry into Peel region. Petra, who had been present and had not intervened, was charged as a party to the offences. She called Sandra 3 times the night the charges were announced, and Sandra, to her credit, did not answer. Sandra's position in all of this is something I've thought about more than anything else. She is not a good person, or she stopped being one at some point in the previous 2 years. But she had also been managed and shaped and slowly convinced by her own mother that what was happening to Emma was acceptable, was even beneficial. And I do not entirely know where the line is between being manipulated and being culpable. The courts will draw that line. It's not my place to draw it for her. What I know is that she was told, in explicit audio-recorded detail, that her mother intended to use her daughter's phobia against her as a control mechanism, and she did not stop it. Emma knows that. Emma will have to come to terms with that on her own schedule, with the help of her therapist, and not on anyone else's timeline. Sandra's parental access was suspended pending the criminal proceedings and a custody review. Emma moved permanently into a new apartment I found in Oakville, just the 2 of us, with a school that came recommended by the child psychologist and a backyard big enough to matter. No utility room she can't get out of. Every light switch accessible from the doorway. We went together to pick out the nightlight for her bedroom, and she chose one in the shape of a polar bear, because she told me the week before that polar bears don't seem scared of anything. The estate fraud case moved through civil channels. Vivienne's other 2 children, Sandra's siblings, had not known about the redirected funds and engaged their own lawyers the moment Patrick's findings were shared with them. The civil judgment came down 8 months after the criminal charges. Vivienne was ordered to repay $338,000 in misappropriated funds plus interest and penalties. Her assets were not sufficient to cover it. Her house in Gatineau went to satisfy part of the judgment. Petra pleaded guilty to her charge and received a conditional sentence and 2 years probation. The conditions included mandatory counseling and no contact with Emma for 5 years. Vivienne's trial ran for 12 days. I attended every day that my work schedule allowed, and on the days I couldn't attend, Warren did. He texted me updates from the courthouse. On the day the verdict was read, Emma was at school, and I sat in the courtroom beside my lawyer and listened to the judge say guilty on all counts in the specific quiet voice that trial judges use when they want to make sure every person in the room hears exactly what's being said. Sentencing was 3 weeks later. I did not bring Emma. I went alone. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Justice Brenda O'Culloch. She had read the psychological report on Emma. She had reviewed the audio recordings in their entirety. When she addressed the court before announcing the sentence, her voice was measured in the way that contains a great deal that isn't being said aloud. Mrs. Lachance, you presented yourself throughout this process as a devoted grandmother whose actions were misunderstood. The evidence does not support that characterization. The evidence supports the conclusion that you deliberately exploited a child's known fears to control her behavior, that you coached others to facilitate this, and that you used your position within your family to conceal it. You were not acting out of love or concern. You were acting out of a desire for control that had nothing to do with the welfare of your granddaughter. She paused. This court sentences you to 3 years in federal custody, with no eligibility for day parole for the first 18 months. Vivienne Lachance was 63 years old. 3 years federal means she will be 66 when she is released, assuming no extensions. Her house is gone. Her estate executor status has been revoked. Her relationship with Sandra's siblings is not recoverable. Her relationship with Sandra is something I don't have clear information on and don't require it. I went back to Warren's after sentencing. He'd taken the afternoon off. Laurel had made dinner. Emma was there after school, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with Warren's oldest, Theo, who is 11, and has treated Emma with the uncomplicated acceptance of a kid who just needed someone to sit beside him at the table. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before anyone noticed me. Emma was humming. That little tuneless half-melody. She was somewhere good inside her own head. Warren appeared at my shoulder. "How'd it go?" 3 years, I said. He nodded. We didn't say anything else for a bit. That felt right. The custody order came through 5 weeks after sentencing. Full custody, no conditions, with a therapeutic access arrangement for Sandra to be reviewed annually pending her compliance with the court-ordered parenting program. Emma's name on the order. My name on the order. My name on the order. Nobody else's. The thing I want to say, if anyone is listening to this and recognizes something in it, is that the cameras mattered. I installed them 8 months before that afternoon in Timmins because something in the way Emma described weekends at her mother's had changed. In the particular way that children can't always name what's wrong, but show it in the pauses in their sentences. I didn't know what I was preparing for. I just knew the instinct from years of professional training that said, when something feels wrong and you can't verify it, document everything and wait. That instinct saved my daughter. Document everything. Talk to your children the way that makes them feel safe telling you things. And if a child tells you something is wrong, believe them the first time. In Canada, if you have concerns about a child's safety, you can contact your provincial child protection service. In Ontario, the Children's Aid Society can be reached at 1-800-718-188. Kids Help Phone is available at 1-800-68-6868 for children and youth across the country. Emma starts a new art class next month. She told me she wants to learn how to draw horses. She told me this in the car on the way home from school last Tuesday, humming to herself in the back seat, watching the houses go by outside the window. I think about the fact that she's okay, that she can still hum like that, and I hold on to it like it's the most important thing I've ever held, because it is.